Good morning. I'm doing my job of breaking up really good conversations. There's I'm Fritz Steiner, and I'm the dean of the Weitzman School. And good morning. Um, and on behalf of the Weitzman faculty, students, and staff, welcome. This is a morning of welcomes. Uh, there's two events this morning. I had an 8:30 welcome and a now this 9:30 welcome. And the 8:30 welcome is a symposium, a workshop actually that David Leatherborough organized, and my old colleague Michael Benedict from UT is involved in. Uh, it's about the architecture of time. So it's not unusual for us to do more than one symposium a day. Just oh gosh, there's so many. This is like a landscape friendly group. Everywhere I look, there's a different memory. It's not unusual for us to do more than one symposium at a time or one workshop at a time. Just a couple weeks ago, we had two. Uh, the one here was on psychedelics, and the one in the Furness building was on concrete. So I was sitting in my office watching. It was fairly, you could tell fairly quickly which one was going to psychedelics and which one was going to concrete. And I, they didn't ask me to welcome either one. And I had an odd experience from the long 60s that involved both concrete and psychedelics. So I would have had some relevant words to say, but I'm really delighted this morning to welcome you and just say a few words in transition. We here are a community of designers, planners, preservationists, data scientists, and artists who are advancing the public good. And this work takes us around Philadelphia, around across the country and abroad, wherever we can apply our skills and expertise. Uh, like another Penn initiative that you might be familiar with, the public art and history studio called Monument Lab, the urban heritage um, project has its roots in the classroom. In the spring of 2012, Randy Mason led a studio in the now Department of Historic Preservation uh, that entered a design competition to reimagine uh, America's national parks, organized by the National Park Service and the Van Allen Institute. Our students completed a project on Civil War defenses in Washington, in Washington, D.C., that was one of the finalists. In the years since, the Urban Heritage Project has engaged the National Park Service, NGOs, and others to document, interpret, and create dozens of plans for public landscape. The team consults historic photographs, maps, primary sources to compile a physical history of each site, analyzing and evaluating its features that sometimes have been lost, and then those that survive. They take the time to understand not just the site's evolution, but its needs and the desires of the community around it. Randy and his team have worked on in various states and various countries, but Washington D.C. has been a center of gravity for their work, and the list of their engagements include the Lincoln Memorial, Pennsylvania Avenue, the Anacostia Park in Fort DuPont, and the historic house and former plantation at Arlington National Cemetery. So the Urban Heritage Project has been entrusted with some of the most iconic sites in our country, along with places that are not on tourist maps but hold tremendous significance for our history. And that tells you a bit about the caliber of the urban uh, history projects, or urban heritage projects, heritage. So take Lewis Mountain in the Shenandoah National Park. It was designed by the Park Service and built by the Civilian Conservation Corps between 1938 and 1942 as a segregated landscape for black campers. It was also at the forefront of desegregation efforts 18 years before Brown versus the Board of Education. So my own introduction to the concept of cultural landscapes was I was an employee once in 1983 at the National Park Service. My brother, who's an FBI agent, was mad because my government rating, that was G11 or 12, was higher than his. But he stayed longer, and in the end, that's another story. So I was working for the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Division here in Philadelphia, and we were pioneering the Blackstone Heritage Corridor, which runs from Worcester, Massachusetts. That better? Yeah. Worcester, Massachusetts to Providence, Rhode Island, the second and third largest cities in New England. And the Blackstone is billed as a place where the American Industrial Revolution began. But the more time I spent there, the more questions I had. What was the corridor's importance to the labor movement? What was the importance to the history of women, the child labor movement, or the history of religions? The orientation of the mills, and many of you probably know this, when you compare it to other mill towns or in New England, the Blackstone was a Quaker, were Quakers, and some of the mill towns were Puritans, and there was a very different sort of spatial organization that occurred in the Blackstone that was different. So the Puritans, of course, were organized more hierarchical, and the Quakers were less hierarchical, and so that was interesting. It's one time in my life when I wrote a plan or a report, and that was sort of my job, was the guy who was writing all this, that was later adopted almost, well, verbatim in Congress. They took all the regulatory stuff out, but otherwise it was pretty much what we wrote. So now Philadelphia abounds with cultural landscapes, and within just a few blocks you have Independence Mall and Washington Square. Although today it's a place of affluence and leisure, Washington Square was the first graveyard for the city's poor and for African Americans, and then for prisoners of war during the American Revolution. So the prisoners of war that the British shot, or they died on their own. Of course, long before that, the Lenape people settled this land. And so there's sort of many layers of cultural history that define a cultural landscape, the reason why we're here today. When we talk about cultural landscape, it's worth remembering that the Park Service put into practice an idea that originated with cultural geographers and ecologists. And I'm thinking of people like J.B. Jackson, the American, how do you categorize, what is uncategorizable individuals who taught at both Berkeley and Harvard. He famously rode back and forth across the country on his motorcycle. And my former home in Austin, Texas was one of the favorite places he stopped. So there's sort of little J.B. Jackson shrines in Austin to commemorate his pit stops in Austin. But Jackson helped us understand our country to the evolution of places and spaces. He helped us see our own culture, to understand the landscape as a vast repository of unwritten histories, and think of the people who have not been viewed or included. And it's a real contribution of the Urban Heritage Project. So I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate Randy and his team, Associate Director Megan Lester, Senior Research Assistant Jake Torkson, Research Associates Meg Frissy, and Elizabeth Dunson. Give them all a hand. I'm almost finished, and we'll turn it over to the real substance in just a moment. But I thought I'd just, the most profound experience maybe that I've had with cultural landscapes was about 20 years ago. And in 2005, I was honored to be one of the finalist teams for the National 9/11 Memorial to the United Airlines Flight 293, United Flight 93. Randy was another finalist, and Thomas's firm was another finalist. Randy and my teams didn't win, but Thomas's team was part of the winning competition. And the plane went down just outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And the reason I decided to enter was I mentioned my brother was an FBI agent, and he subsequently increased his status within the government ranking system, and he was head of the SWAT team in San Francisco and ran the FBI for Northern California, and so he was part of the team in San Francisco, the FBI team that was sort of identifying who was on the plane and who, making those connections. It was awful work, and so that was sort of my inspiration. We designed the visitor center. Someone called our entry, it looked like a piece of air conditioning duct, and it didn't fit the landscape. And that was sort of the idea. Anyway, and the one thing that sort of survived is there was a place where the FBI conducted their investigation, and it was incorporated into the final. Maybe it was one of those obvious ideas that, oh, this is where the FBI is. They were overlooking the site where the crash was. That would be a good place to do something. So anyway, I mentioned my team wasn't selected, but the process was deeply rewarding, and it was, faced with trying to acknowledge something as terrible as 9/11. I understand that the process of commemorating was part of the healing process. And so I think, sadly, we can learn from disasters and be resilient. And I think that's probably, we're entering a period that requires us to be resilient again. And the process of creating a memorial is still a bit mysterious to me. But of this much, I'm sure, our landscapes will outlast us, and will we learn what they have to teach us. So thank you. As I mentioned, I'll be there. We have 2 symposiums, so if I'm not here, I'm in the other symposium. But I feel a great connection to those of you in this room. So, Randy, turn it up for you. Thank you.
Great. So we're recording this, both with video and with audio. So forgive us for occasionally making adjustments. So welcome. I'm just so delighted and grateful that this collection of people are in one room. It's kind of like a dream team of thinking about and working on and thinking about the future. To the point of the Symposium of Cultural Landscape work. So we're just really delighted that you're all here. One of the things we want to do is to make you comfortable. So if you want to move your chair, please move your chair. The chairs are all movable. So if you want to, everyone wants to practice moving your chair, keeping comfortable, getting things to eat. Please, we're trying to make this as informal as a symposium can possibly be. For those of you who I haven't met yet, and I'm happily I've met most of you, I'm Randy Mason, and I've been here at Penn for 21 or so years, and happily working with this amazing group of people who Fritz introduced, and with many of you in the room on projects here and there, now and then. So I'm glad that we kind of have a base of already being in conversation before we get into the 2 days or so of being in more intense conversation. So what I would like to do in this this introductory period in the first session is I'll end up talking more about some of the practicalities of our 2 days together. But I'll start out by talking more about some of the ideas that have been in our minds as we think about organizing a gathering like this, the sort of things that we've learned by reading things that you've written and working on places that you've invited us to work on, and conversations that we've been having. And to hopefully lay out some threads that we can pull over the next couple days in the various sessions, all to the point of giving us and everyone else who's not in the room but part of the community of practice of cultural landscape work more to think about and more problems to solve and more tools to solve them. So we really hope to focus on the future. So the first idea that occurred to me to start with is this idea that has a lot of different aspects, but we'll just start with a kind of a simple statement that cultural landscape is a powerful idea. And this plays out in a couple of different ways, at least a couple of different ways. In my mind, it's powerful because it gives us a whole raft of exciting and significant opportunities to do good in the world, to take care of these long-term responsibilities that Fritz mentioned, to be engaged with the places where we stand and the people with whom we stand. And so I've always seen, being educated as a geographer, first in which have a very, sorry if there are other geographers in the room, a very wonderful but almost entirely passive notion of what cultural landscape is. It's a frame to look through. One of the reasons I got into design is because then you have to do something about it, and you have to act. You have to create treatments. You have to create plans. You have to write about it and convince other people that a place is important or compelling. So I think just the whole idea of cultural landscape work is full of opportunity, and therefore, and therein resides some power. The second aspect of power that I think is kind of underdeveloped, but super important, is that there are small p, I'll call them political processes, attached to all ideas about landscape, all ways that we try to live in and change and adapt and use landscapes. And those are far too often, they've been backgrounded, and we need to be more purposeful about foregrounding those. So there'll be I think a lot of talk about that over these 2 days. And the third way that this plays out is in deep breath, a large P politics. The ways and means of government and governance that at this moment find us in a really perilous place. We have to acknowledge that last week's election creates huge uncertainties about the future of cultural landscapes and all the other futures, and basically about everything. And while we're not here to address the changing political context, we are acknowledging that they're material to what we do, especially for the immediate future, about what we do next month, next year, and with our next projects, however we see that. The federal government, obviously, universities obviously will be under intense pressure to change or transform or retreat. I'm not sure what the right verbs will be. We'll have to figure that out over the next few years. But we're still here. And we'll be here no matter what those transformations are. We'll still be doing this work. You're all here because you all already care and know something about and have an opinion about cultural landscape, what it is, how it works, what it does. And so we have to find ourselves powerful in the face of whatever these political winds are and whatever ways they're blowing and however hard they might be blowing. The other kind of power of cultural landscape to me is relates to, thanks Jake, sorry. I'm clicking at you, but I should be asking, I'm sorry. cultural landscape's power is also, I think, really deeply embedded in language. The power of seeing culture and environment as inseparable and intertwined, and not simply some kind of like third way of something that's not culture and not nature and a separate category. I think that's a huge lost opportunity. But the ubiquity of landscape in everyday language, I think, is something that we really should dwell on for a minute. We've heard a lot recently, I know, deep breath, about landslides and political landscapes in this election season. And there's a takeaway in that, the ways that we see society and the ways that we see our experience of environment are really deeply entwined, such that we use landscape as a way to try to express these deep feelings and deep connections and the deep significance of the connection between ourselves and land and buildings. And the metaphoric use of landscape, which I'll show you a few examples. This is just a search from the New York Times kind of randomly, but the first three things that came up are I'm trying to top Fritz here on the references, the oblique references to drug use. The opera landscape, the marijuana landscape, and the museum landscape. And we can all immediately think, you probably are thinking, these other metaphoric uses of landscape that are, I think, really, we need to interrogate them. There are, I think, very clear reasons why we use them. And they to me, always remind me of a great phrase that Paul Groth started one of his great essays in, one of those, I can't remember which collection it was, sorry, about how cultural landscapes, that we're like fish and cultural landscapes are like water, and that it's so present that we fail to see it, or we fail to see them, we fail to see that way. So I think this kind of peeling back of the water, or peeling back of the languages of landscape, whether it's the voting landscape or, next please, Jelani Cobb, it's probably too pixelated, talking about the landscape of possibilities of what comes next. This is one of the kind of day after the election essays, or next one more. FIFA, the professional football landscape. So it's in the obviously profound senses, but also in more kind of glibly used senses, that this powerful notion of landscape, and all these uses I would regard as cultural landscape, because the culture might be implied, but it's absolutely using landscape to communicate something about the shape of the world and our living in it. So next, please, Jake. Thanks. I'll just have this picture up for a minute. The next thing I wanted to pivot to is this idea that we all walk in the door with some notion of cultural landscape already in mind, because of what we've done, what we've read, and who we are, but not the same idea, I bet. And if I was going to do that kind of snarky professorial thing, I'd give everybody an index card and ask them to write their definition on there. We won't go there, but I think we have to acknowledge that that the profusion of definitions of cultural landscape is not a critique. It's actually something to celebrate, that we have all these different and complementary ways of using cultural landscape, kind of gives us a fund of ideas that we can draw on. This gathering, therefore, is not meant to define cultural landscape or kind of compel you to agree on one particular notion or concept, whether it's the one that I write, or the one that the Park Service uses, or the one that one of us uses in our practice. We have to kind of celebrate both the kind of richness of thought and word and deed, and also that this is something that compels us to evolve the way that we talk and think about cultural landscapes as we think about what comes next in our future. The community of practice, which is a term that I first kind of was compelled to research this in doing a project with Sean Eyring years ago. It to me really captures this kind of social network that we all share but haven't been able to name, because it's different from disciplines, and it's different from the categories in the bookstore shelves, and it's different from, it collects a lot of different disciplines and professions and kind of ways of thinking. But this community of practice and the richness of it, I think, is mapped by these different conceptions of what cultural landscape is, and how do we talk about it, and how do we see it. the question of why to do this now, we didn't purposely plan this to do it right after the election. I promise you. That was, you know, as you probably remember, we had to kind of reschedule this a few times, which I won't go into. But we ended up landing in this moment that seems like the urgency is palpable. Well, the urgency was already there. When it comes to landscape, the cultural landscape, we were already in this age of intense urgency of the issues that we need to deal with. And needing to push back against the complacency that often kind of like weighs on us when we get in the habit of doing anything. So the reason to have the gathering now was to kind of redouble our efforts to think about how we project notions of cultural landscape to address the biggest issues that we face. So whether you think of climate adaptation or energy transition, extractive capitalism, migration and borders, food systems, tourism and tourism economies, and failures of governance, when it comes to whether it comes to public land and buildings or other failures, all of these issues or problems, I would argue, are problems of cultural landscape. They're problems about how we think about, conceptualize, see, and act on this world that we inhabit and this world that we experience. So the way the cultural landscapes are produced and the way they're experienced and the way that we talk about them, represent them, I think are all material to our ability to deal in these problems. They're not, you know, with all due respects to our colleagues at Wharton or the engineering school, these problems that I listed are not technical problems. They are not economic problems. They are those as well, but I say fundamentally they're problems of culture and cultural landscape. So this slide, I always use to kind of remind myself that that we can't trust what we see. And some of you who have had me in other settings might remember this. Don't call it out. But somebody who's never seen this photograph before, can you tell me the title of it? This is the part where you raise your hands and participate in class. Before I start calling on people. Who seems to be using their phone? Let's see. Anyone? Fritz, do you want to make a guess? Okay, 2 other guesses. One on this side. Manish.
I was thinking Valley came to mind first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone on this side. I'm sorry if you guys can't quite see, but
Distant Meadow.
Distant Meadow. You're all really not close at all. The title of this, next slide, please. It's called Alaska Pipeline by a photographer named Skeet McCauley. And if you look in the top in the background, you see kind of a shiny tube. So we're all seeing something different. We're seeing an aspen grove. We're seeing a pipeline. We're seeing the ruination of the world through extraction of carbon and burning of carbon. There's a lot in this. And this is a kind of a reminder of both the power and potential of cultural landscape thinking and work, but also the need to have humility about it as well. Okay, so next slide, please. And I will try to go through these super quick, but I wanted to be explicit about some of the propositions that are in my mind in terms of where we go next in the futures of cultural landscape preservation. And these are there's kind of 4 themes that come back to me again and again. Next, please, Jake. The first is this, this kind of core concept of a cultural landscape being a holistic idea. The facile version of that is that it's about culture and nature. And we can talk a lot about that very profitably. The part that really compels me in terms of an edge of change in cultural landscape work is when it comes to governance, which we'll talk about separately in a moment. But if we think about how, despite how holistically we might see this street scene in the Fairmount neighborhood in Philadelphia, the way that we manage it, the way that we govern it, it's so fragmented that it kind of borders on the ridiculous. So the question I ask about this image is, if you start in a house on the top of the photograph and you walk across the street to a house on the other side of the street, how many government departments do you cross? So just stop when you get to 10, because then you've accepted my point. It's ridiculously fragmented. Everything from the parking authority, the parks authority, the buildings authority, you name it. So we have to deal with the kind of the craziness of fragmentation, and cultural landscape ideas give us ways to model that, if not to implement it, at least to model it. Next, please. Change. Another one of the kind of superpowers of cultural landscape thinking, and this is particularly pointed to my colleagues who are traditional historic preservationists, is that the whole theory is based on change. By definition, everything in a cultural landscape changes. They change in different ways, different rates, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a theoretical model that it is a theoretical model based on change, is a subtle but really profound point. It's not a model based on a steady state, which preservation has always tried to kind of kind of protect that conceit for themselves. So this creates really big problems for how we model change, but this has been around for a while. Other disciplines, lots of disciplines work with this already, ecology being one of them. Ryan Drake, I'm really glad you're here because you turned me on to this. I'm a big fan of this Robert Cook essay called Is Landscape Preservation an Oxymoron? That he wrote, I don't know, 20 years ago. Ryan went deeper and got the original McHarg lecture from 1999, in which he talks about how an ecologist thinks about landscapes, and one aspect of landscape change, which is that they learn, based on his simplistic but I think profound diagram about his study of violets and forest floors. So if you want a really great short read, we can send you the PDF that Ryan has grabbed out of our archive. So thank you for that. Next, please. Time is another kind of incredibly rich and vexing issue to deal with when it comes to cultural landscapes. But I would argue that the whole idea of cultural landscape is infused with time, because this idea of layering, of the kind of differential erosion of experiences and material aspects of the landscape being present and then not present, being in one state today and another state tomorrow, makes us be historians or to study time seriously. And there's just such an amazing literature out there about studying time seriously and in very provocative ways. And just to throw out a few of the titles that I've been very provoked by and informed by over the last few years, from architectural historians to geographers to another uncategorizable person, Stuart Brand, who wrote this among his books, the Clock of the Long Now, which kind of rests on this distinction that I've found very useful and also provocative about distinguishing the right now from the long now. And if we think about the long future, it doesn't mean we're not doing something right now, but it's just a different now. So again, there's lots to think about in these works and others that you all are probably thinking of right now too. Next, please. And lastly, governance, to come back to this idea about, like, once we understand something, how do we try to change it or not change it? How do we intervene? How do we place ourselves in the landscape? Famously, J.B. Jackson was taught us about these wonderful patterns that hidden in plain sight, and we need to study them more carefully. Everything from roads to people fixing cars in their driveways and fences. But the distinction I'd like to make is that let's not stop with the fence. Let's make sure that we understand what the fence does, and the fence as an agent for change, or the property line as an agent for change. The geographer Ken Olwig years ago wrote a really amazing book about a whole different cultural landscape paradigm based in law and property, not in materiality or visibility, as the tradition is usually kind of interpreted. And again, I think we need to go back to this to recover a deeper, more complicated model of the politics of cultural landscape. So next, I think this is my last slide. We're getting close to the real content. So the symposium itself, I've talked already about some of the kind of desires we have for it, to really think about the future, to not spend a lot of time talking about what cultural landscape is, but more like what it can do, and about this community of practice, and to continue to think about what is this community of practice and how do we change it, expand it, or put it to work more profoundly. And so the practicalities, some of the practicalities that I will try to outline and then depend on my colleagues Molly and Jake and Elizabeth and Meg to remind me of all the things I'm forgetting. Um, First of all, this is, as Fritz mentioned, this is an outgrowth of the work that we've been doing for more than 10 years, often with the National Park Service, and thanks to those of you who are here who we've worked with over the years. We are also supported and have to recognize the material support, not only of the school, Fritz, thank you very much, and also the Robin M. Beckett Endowment Fund of the Historic Preservation Department, which has just enabled us to stage this and bring everyone together. There are a lot of people wanted to come who couldn't come, or we didn't have room, which we were a little bit chagrined about, but really happy about. That there's more of an audience than is in this room, and therefore we're recording this both in video and audio. We have some publication plans, but we don't know what they are yet, so we'll be thinking about that over the next couple days. Please share our ideas about how you think this can be shared or should be shared. And I, just before getting into the very last details, wanted to acknowledge that there are other very important people and agencies and institutions in our community of practice around cultural landscape that aren't here, whether it's folks working on Park Service sites or World Heritage sites, people doing scholarship, some of whom we talked to about being here, but they couldn't make it for whatever reason. We had a couple of virtual pre-events that you may have heard about and seen with folks like Laura Alice Watt, folks like Julie McGilvray and Jennifer Hanna, and we had 3 of them. How many of you actually looked at even one of those pre-events? Okay, I'll take that as a sign of success. We tried to figure out how to have more if we only had these 2 days, so that was one idea about how to kind of expand on it. And also, I think we have to understand the advocates for cultural landscape, as those of us in academia or in the Park Service or elsewhere are kind of doing the work on the ground. People like Charles Birnbaum, the Cultural Landscape Foundation, Brenda Barrett, and the Living Landscape Observer, and countless advocates at local levels and in regions. Are also doing this work, are also part of our community of practice, and so we're speaking with them today as well. The sessions themselves are organized around different perspectives on cultural landscape work. The one after the keynotes this morning from Andrea Roberts and Robert Melnick, we'll have a session on Park Service perspectives and how those are changing, followed by several folks who are in the design world and how they use cultural landscape ideas implicitly and explicitly. Tomorrow, we'll start with a session about Indigenous communities and how that reflects how that teaches us about cultural landscape in a profoundly different way. And in the afternoon, a session about research with folks coming from an academic perspective. And we're ending tomorrow afternoon with a session literally about the future, because it's the kind of middle generation of professionals, folks like Molly and Jake and Meg and Jenny Lauer and others who are invited here to create the session themselves, to conduct us in thinking over a couple of days about the future and articulating some kind of, to the extent it can emerge, a shared agenda for what happens after the symposium. And so we'll talk a little bit more about a process leading up to that final session as the other sessions start this afternoon. Other last details. There are signs all over the place telling you where important stuff is, like bathrooms. So if you can't find the signs, find one of us, and we'll guide you to the nearest facility. There's also a water machine out nearby. I think I've remembered everything. The recordings will live on our website, www.cultural-landscapes.org. I have no commercial interest. That's thoroughly an academic undertaking. And we'll be in touch with all of you after the symposium about the details of when it's available and what's available. So with that, I will wrap up. I would love to talk about lunch. Yeah, it's not quite lunchtime yet, but after the keynotes, if those of you who are speakers, there will be lunch in Meyerson Hall. So come and find one of us from the UHP team about where that is. And otherwise, in the program, there's a whole map and list of good lunch places nearby. We'll have an hour and a half to do it, so you can go enjoy a little stretch of West Philly if and as you like. And then we'll reconvene here in the afternoon for session 1 at 1 o'clock. Okay, cool. It's my my next job, happily, to introduce the two keynote speakers. And I'll introduce one, and then after her talk, I'll introduce the second. There are bios in your program, and I'm personally I'm averse to reading those bios. It always kind of sounds like my mom wrote it, and you know, it gets a little bit long and embarrassing. So, with apologies, I just wanted to give an informal introduction. First to my colleague, Professor Andrea Roberts, who comes to us today from University of Virginia and Department of Urban Environmental Planning, well known to many of us for her work in with the Texas Freedom Colonies and the Outsider Preservation Project, and many other things that you'll probably hear about in just a moment. So with that, let me invite Andrea to come up and take the podium, and we'll get on to these really two wonderful keynotes. Thank you.
For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge for passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us, for all of us, this instant and this triumph we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So, it is better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive. Audre Lorde, A Litany for Survival. It is the morning of November 6, 2024, and my consolation is remembering I was never meant to survive, let alone see some version of myself in the White House or this majority white community I live in. But I clearly have. I remember these words about speaking, and then I consider the right to listen to what the earth can tell those of us never meant to survive, let alone thrive. I recall what so many of us who practice mindfulness are constantly reminded to practice, and that is just noticing. Next. I just noticed while walking the Crozet Connector Trail. Well, I live in Crozet, Virginia, 13 miles from University of Virginia and 15 miles from the Shenandoah National Park, equidistant between rest and labor. I live like someone always contemplating what lies beneath, on, and above me because, as my friend Julie McGilvery told me long ago, landscapes are everything and everywhere. And labor created it all, including the trails that connected all the planned neighborhoods, including where I live, Western Ridge. There's the mountain greeting me, the asphalt sidewalks incline warming up the calves. I start a brisk walk to shake off the strange sense of being totally abandoned by the country. I'm just noticing. The walk from my front door down to the Crozet Connector Trail has become the lifeblood of my mornings and what awakens me to the possibility that I might make a dent in the to-do list. I begin my walk and pass the community clubhouse. I recall the story in the Crozet Gazette about the 1858 clubhouse, but I'm just noticing. Next. The practice isn't working this morning. I still feel cracked open, eyes tired. I try to walk in such a way that I can feel as if the sun and the trees have colluded, more than allies. I make believe that they have co-conspired to shower me with yellow gold light. At least this landscape has. I pass little benches where the sun again shimmers shamelessly overhead, down upon the water and onto the bench like a stage spotlight. The birds, not all of these heard that day, but I listened for as many as I could and anchored myself in the reliability of the 7:30 a.m. Canadian geese flyover. Next. I realize it is human-made, cookie-cutter, bare-bone pathways, the paths well-trod, and not always playing nicely with the tree root systems, the wooden benches and bridges, the tree clearing. But it is time for more than noticing. The roots, lovely as they are also a trip hazard. They are exposed. I met others walking the trail that felt equally exposed and hesitantly acknowledging one another and speaking of a shared sense of loss. We've been exposed, the older women seemed to say to me sheepishly. Next. I noticed that all of our roots were exposed after the night. Before, I keep noticing the care the volunteer crew takes in the landscape, earnestly avoiding most damage to the roots when installing bridges and stairs, but I'm also struck by a broader, almost invisible disregard for this landscape's earlier life. There's nothing more than a sign with a date to hint at what happened in that house, I recall, but nothing to force us to contend with what brought us to November 6th, even if it was right below our feet. Next. On the way back, I passed the clubhouse again. The community, Western Ridge, was built by Hunter Craig in the 1990s, but this clubhouse was almost bulldozed in 2003. But it is largely intact, except the back is the front and the front is now the back, as is often the case with historic homes. The Fretwell Cree House, as it was known from the 1850s to the 1940s, I would learn in a lovely article in our community newspaper, the Crozet Gazette, called This Old House at Western Ridge by Heidi Brown, would tell us that this home was once one that held 12 people in captivity ages 1 to 50. Burlington Fretwell inherited part of this property in 1836. He married Elizabeth Jarman in 1844, and by 1856 he amassed 185 acres along Three Notch Road, including the beautiful creek and basin I began this talk with. Next. We know this because a letter from the University of Virginia Special Collections and 1850 slave schedules featured in the Crozet Gazette feature story about the house showed us the ages 1 to 50 of those human beings. And the owner also wrote letters to his brother, which are also in that collection, about the conditions in which those people lived, including one enslaved person who eventually ran away many times. He writes, "Dear brother, Harry left here last Sunday and hasn't come back. He took up with an old wooden leg woman in Covington in July and has been up there nearly every Sunday since. He has been out of place nearly every Monday morning, long after the other hands have got to work. I gave him 3 or 4 whippings about it. The last one last Monday was a week, and I told him then I would whip him every time he was out of place on Monday morning hereafter." He asked Franklin to keep an eye out for that runaway. Next. The mark of slavery and racial capitalism is never far from me on the trail, a trail where I imagine fugitive enslaved people running, hiding. I sit and stand in these spaces, these trees, and unknowingly I am seeing the remnants of their bondage in these spaces. These are culverts made by enslaved labor in 1853. Local historian Mary Lyons writes about the 300 enslaved laborers along with over 1,000 Irish immigrants who were paid, who worked under the engineer Crozet's supervision to fulfill Virginia's long goal of linking the navigable rivers of the Chesapeake Bay watershed with the Ohio River and points west. And these enslaved laborers were rented from their owners, some of whom were affiliated with the University of Virginia, who pocketed the money themselves, grateful for extra income. Mary Lyons writes about how between 1849 and 1859, the same period of the Fretwell letters, that Virginia raced to pierce the Blue Ridge Mountains by rail, and that the state leased the labor of enslaved Virginians from local slaveholders from Albemarle County families, including the Carters, the Maupins, the Jarmans, and Mosbys, to hire out their slaves to the state for this purpose, unquote. While local historians conduct research shared in our local paper, and even published books and markers are made, our collusion with the landscape and racial capitalism persists. These laborers were expendable. Inclusion, diversity, belonging are all also expendable and at the whim of the marketplace. I think about how often we are supposed to be grateful for being noticed, but there's some noticing that would reveal layers of history that would disturb my neighbors. But I already hold that disturbance. I hold it whether I want to or not. But how might this space of solace also be made what Dennis Byrne calls a nervous landscape, where dominant culture spatially controls a population's presence in and movement through a landscape while incorporating the full range of methods a minority group may use to subvert that system of spatial control? That contestation makes the built environment tense and nervous. That post-November 5th morning, I was already nervous, but I didn't want to be nervous alone. But like so many of us who ran to nature and away from the news cycle, I wanted the nervousness also to end. But once the roots have been exposed, what are we compelled to do? Not as owners, consumers, or visitors, but as the enlightened cultural landscape preservationists and seers we all believe ourselves to be. We know what to do professionally. All the greatest minds are here. But what is it about this work that makes the spaces closest to us, to me, the most difficult and not always productively nervous? Next. So I posed this question about not only what we're to do, but more basically, what are cultural landscapes? Because to understand their potential, it's important to understand, I think, what people actually believe and think they are. I asked this fundamental question, knowing that, as Alison Schwann says, a cultural landscape is a way of seeing and being. It is not just the land, not just the scenery, but what we construct as we shape the world through our senses, our individual and collective memory and narratives and personal cognition, all communicated between generations, unquote. Sounds very good. But what does the rest of the world say? Next. Well, here's some folks. There's a strong implication of a dominant position that defines a landscape as somehow atypical, the other part, yet worthy of pillaging, co-opting from a position of power, the colonialist part. Next. That it is time to go. This person isn't really interested in the intersecting stories of people and their places, but might be up for tenure. I kind of like that one. It stings, but that they were searching for a way to say redlining, but like at a dinner party. Always sounds the Kill Bill alarm in my head. Next. Strangely, for someone such as myself who leads tours through historic spaces, when I hear the words cultural landscape, my mind doesn't really think of the latter word in terms of physical space. It's like, for me, the phrase is about cultural zeitgeist, as Randy was mentioning earlier. As someone who regularly works in around this term, maybe I should have a different answer. But my gut says academia, as in, this is a jargon term used to formalize ways of knowing and being that communities have practiced for always. Next. All of these reveal a sense of insiderness, outsider, exclusion, elitism. These are the perceptions. But being a cultural landscape preservationist is about perception, the art of perception. But how do we wrestle with how we, the great perceivers, are perceived? This is some of the work of the cultural landscapes, the Center for Cultural Landscapes, to face ourselves and open up our world to those who might already be doing the work, but never thought so before, but didn't believe they were before, as students, practitioners, community members, or stewards. Our mission is twofold: increasing awareness of the historical, ecological, and social value of cultural landscapes, elevating innovative public and scholarly work at the intersection of culture, identity, land, and power. Internally, we have a number of projects, everything from the Elizabeth Rogers Archive, Sarah Schellenberger Brown Fund events, conversation, external projects, the partnership we have, for example, with Montpelier Descendants Communities, the National Park Service, by way of the Texas Historical Commission, the National Endowment for Humanities Summer Institute for Higher Education Teachers, the LSI, all number of projects. Next. And I still continue my deep listening and seeing in solidarity with Freedom Colony descendants like myself. The platform, the Texas Freedom Colonies Project Atlas and Study, still holds and stewards place histories in what I call a Black world of worlds. It now holds the names, origin stories, or histories of places associated with names of freedom colonies, about 526 at last count, independent Black settlements founded 1865 to 1930. But it's not the fact of the map, but the use of the map that matters and guides the current work. It's something more than noticing the point. It's noticing the place and the landscape. Next. The work of that project is best explained by telling the story of the late Irene Palmer in that lovely green dress near her house. Born in 1944 in Newton County, Texas, to Jesse and Leela Clack, she shared with me over several years her relationship to her freedom colony and her home place. She persisted in place even when she had only one income after losing her husband in 1989. She would tell me that at one time, this Pleasant Hill was a big community. All they did was farm and take care of children. If one had, all had. Everybody was on the same level. All they had back in the day was logging, and they would load or pluck wood on hands and shoulder. They supported their families that way. She'd wave her arms to indicate the spatial and kinship relationships that once covered the landscape surrounding her home. Across the creek was cousins, kinfolks there together. We raised and farmed on the land. Grandparents on Daddy's side were there. The Kings lived up near there, near the church. Palmer often cut her timber to cover the rising tax bill. She also had managed her children to pay taxes. She would tell them all the time, lots of land around here, people died, and young people got put off because, quote, they did not pay the taxes. Keep up with receipts, that's the way they do, the poor Black folks, and then say they didn't pay their taxes, unquote. These children left for big cities in California, she explained, never to be seen again. Her homecoming celebration speeches and storytelling were sprinkled with these pressing challenges of maintaining connection, return, and recommitment to the preservation of that landscape. Next. These stewardship challenges, that dedication and her creativity shaped the expansion of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project to the Outsider Preservation Initiative. The more I met women like Palmer, I asked myself, what are the points of entry into the world of cultural landscape preservation? Where are the Miss Palmers, the keepers of place heritage, the church stewards, supported, welcomed, and funded? And so this initiative is in conversation, much like the Sankofa bird from our earlier logo, in conversation with the Miss Palmers, with the founders and keepers, often women, of these places, of these landscapes, as you see in the logo to the right. The Outsider Preservation Initiative, created in the spirit of the outsider or visionary artist, led by often spiritual zeal to prophesize or see deeply through art, we are investing in those projects through funding from the Mellon Foundation in descendant-led place activation projects that elevate the heritage of placemaking and precipitate this diasporic return. Those people that left Miss Palmer, how do we help people bring them back, simply? And how do we support creative means of doing that in Texas, Virginia, Louisiana, Maryland, DC, and California, these places chosen based on census data and migration patterns? We want to support place stewards and creatives, telling the story of beginnings, returns, freedom-seeking, and reparative preservation. This involves building a new web portal, de-emphasizing points, but instead creative visualizations of place, visualizing the work or promoting the work of our grantees, descendant-led preservation pedagogy, and hybrid communities of practice in which descendants and experts devise solutions to challenges to descendant-led place preservation. Next. Now I'm going to end with a few examples of some of what I mean when I say the words diasporic work. And this is one example from September 2023. a gathering at the Jefferson Heritage Center in Charlottesville of descendant communities from Virginia, from Central Virginia, primarily meeting with descendants of enslaved communities and historic Black towns from the West, from Blackdom, New Mexico, from Nicodemus, Kansas, from Allensworth, California, to have an exchange about what is the same and what is different about the nature of their stewardship challenges. And to do a little blue sky thinking with a lot of those Post-it notes, which essentially said we need money, so that's why I asked for money. Next. And it included an exhibit with over 8 years of my photography from my work with descendant communities in Texas and new work with descendants in Virginia and even Nova Scotia, where there are 52 historic Black settlements. Next. And we also had the opportunity to have a wonderful kickoff of strategic planning for the Outsider Preservation Initiative, which doesn't sound very exciting, but we wanted to do or create a more embodied approach to introducing the initiative. So we invited Stacy Allen, who is there in the middle, a multidisciplinary artist, filmmaker, and dancer, to lead the entire School of Architecture in a site activation exercise in which several folks came up with a movement that represented sense of place associated with home, and then it became a dance. Hopefully we have sound. No sound? Well, I think it's still beautiful. But nonetheless, if you can get a number of landscape architects and planners to dance on a Monday night, I think that's called success. So this is arts-based activation, and we partnered with more local outsider preservationists. We can go to the next one. This is Carmen Smith. Our students worked with Carmen Smith, who is a electrical engineer who has dedicated all of her funds, all of her support, all of her livelihood to saving a Rosenwald school in Fluvanna County, Virginia, just a few miles from Monticello. This project was to adapt and scope a project in partnership with that descendant that created a new site that activated people's interest in the heritage. She essentially had a room chock full of all types of newspapers, farm equipment, boxes of newspapers, books, but no order. And so my students in rural planning and preservation practice helped create some of that order. And that was meant to, and as it did, precipitate the return of some of our elders in that community to ask us what's next. They asked us what's next. Next. And this is from Tuesday. My new project manager and I visited Madison County African American Historical Society's headquarters with Nancy Williams and Misha Jones. They're about an hour from Charlottesville and almost an hour and a half from Washington, D.C. They are along Highway 29 where there's tremendous growth, but they have yet to succumb to the encroachment most other places are falling prey to. We then joined the owners of Graves Mill Farm, a 10-minute drive away. Their 2,000-acre farm in Madison County includes space for nonprofits and artists, and they're engaged in a discussion on co-stewardship planning for programming, access, and protection of cemeteries on their property where the enslaved are interred. This is part of our center's collaboration with the Arc of Enslaved Communities initiative of the Montpelier Descendants Committee, which is challenging us to think differently about participatory mapping of enslaved families, communities, and final resting places. We're helping the MDC devise creative ways to reconnect families torn apart by enslavement in a 9-county region through mapping memories of placemaking and an oral history initiative. Kemp and Tommy Hill, the owners, are exploring cooperative stewardship models representing something more than just noticing a Black presence on their land. It is an active mindfulness. It's what I call an enforced mindfulness that convicts some of us to be a different kind of steward. These bodies, I write in one of my other pieces that some of you may be familiar with, as are reminders that tell us that the legacy of slavery and labor, the unfree, both shape and are part of the environment we presently inhabit. The geographies holding the afterlives of slavery provide opportunities to notice that the right to be human carries in it a history of racial encounters and innovative Black diaspora practices that spatialize acts of survival, and I argue a poetics of survival. Moving from haunting to mindfulness to enforce mindfulness requires a shift out of all of us, a shift in attention power and a welcoming of new ideas about expertise and stewardship. Next. Through the Outsider Preservation Initiative and other center initiatives, our team and affiliate researchers lead, collaborate, research, and fund in ways that represent what I hope are a survival poetics of landscape preservation. Much of what inspired my talk today was inspired not only by the work of Audre Lorde, but also the latest quantum biography titled Survival is a Promise by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Gumbs reminds us in her work that we need the depth of Audre's life, we need her survival poetics, unquote, and that the scale of the life of the poet is the scale of the universe. She also writes that weather patterns, supernovas, geological scales of transformation, radioactive dust, Lorde referenced the natural world in her poems not as a metaphor, but as a map for how to understand our lives as part of every manifestation of Earth. What if we saw in Black women and anyone in any landscape this manifestation? As we talk about land and the Earth's future, we should meet that future inspired by a spirit that transcends time and space to meet us here. If she survives, calling back to us in a freedom afterlife, we can survive. Next. So I leave you with this survival poetics of landscape preservation, which requires of us mindfulness, noticing as a gateway. This is the work most of you are doing as educators, as designers, historians, interpreters, practitioners. It is exposing the root and seeing it as more than a trip hazard. Decentering our often God's eye view and being accountable and shifting to this enforced mindfulness and bringing the outside, the seemingly outside, in. This is all labor, the labor we often leave or take from others. But in the post-November 5th world we live in, the labor is what will ensure we survive. This labor, this enforced mindfulness and survival poetics offers an opportunity to reclaim. It offers an opportunity to reclaim the most errant, alive, and wild parts of ourselves. All of our lives depend on it. For me, that is poetry about Blackness and imaginaries and possibilities and the spaces that incubate them. And it's one that I hope to cultivate along with all of you in this new world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was incredibly powerful, and I'm sure that my notes didn't capture half of the lessons that I'll take away as I think about that over the next few days. Thank you for so many threads to pull. So I would suggest that after we save questions for whatever time remains after the next keynote and up to our limit of 11:30 for this session. But do write them down and keep them because we will have time to have questions. But with no further ado, we've also asked a second keynote speaker to join us. Many of you are already quite familiar with Professor Robert Melnick, former Dean at University of Oregon, former Getty Grant Program, Senior Program Officer, and I didn't know until I read your bio, the first historic landscape architect of the National Park Service. I think there's got to be a big piece of hardware on your shelf from that. But we're really grateful that you came across the country to join us and to inspire us with some of your thoughts about the future of cultural landscape preservation. Robert.
As always, since I first met her, I am very inspired by Andrea's work. Thank you very much for that. I want to thank Randy and his team, especially Jake and others, for the invitation to be here today, and to my dear old friend, Fritz Steiner. as well. We go back to when Fritz was an assistant professor at an unnamed university. I also want to recognize some of my colleagues here today, Julie, obviously, Allison, Andrea, Brenda Williams, Lori Matthews, Beth, Stephanie, and a whole bunch of other people who I've had the pleasure to know and work with over the last number of years. I want to say, for starters, that I expect that not all of you will agree with every point that I want to make today. And actually, I hope that's the case. You need to challenge me as well as I hope to challenge you. These comments are based on events, on a career that I frankly never expected to have, and I never thought would last as long as it has. Believe me, that was a shock to me and my family. I wanted to, as Lori knows, I want to turn attention to a range and scale of issues beyond the traditional tasks of landscape identification, documentation, and treatment, either at a planning or a site scale. Cultural landscape conservation and protection need to go far beyond what we have done in the past as we face a future filled with certain uncertainty, as you just heard from Andrea regarding the events of last week. As Donald Rumsfeld, I believe you, not one of my favorite sources, told us some years ago, as we know, there are known knowns, things we know about. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things out there that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know that we don't know. And in many ways, those are the ones that are most frightening, the most scary, and especially as we look forward to January 20th of this coming year. Cultural landscape preservation, as has been practiced for the past 45 years and beyond, is often too narrow in scope, too tightly bound in our own silos, and too unwilling to change in response to shifting contexts, whether environmental, cultural, ethical, societal, or especially now political. We all have views, beliefs, principles, and biases, and we should not relinquish those. I actually am a firm believer in having a bias. There are things you really like. I love eggplant. My wife hates it. She loves Jell-O. I can't stand it. Okay. We need to understand where we are in both time and place and locate ourselves in both a temporal and geographic context, as you heard from Randy. And we need to do that as individuals, as communities, and as a society. This is what drives our efforts at cultural landscape protection. We are at the most fundamental level driven to know, understand, and protect multiple contexts. And I think that's evidenced by the sessions today and tomorrow that there is already an ongoing effort in this regard. So I thank all of you for doing that work. I'd like to start with a very brief history, put my comments in context, and I did promise Randy this would be very, very short. In January of 1980, for many reasons, I found myself in DC without a job. I had taken a leave from my teaching position at Kansas State and couldn't return till August of that year. In a search for advice, I called Susan Buggy. Susan was then Chief of Historic Resources in Parks Canada. I had met Susan at the first two meetings of the group that became the Alliance for Historic Landscape Preservation, the first at New Harmony, Indiana in 1978, where I arrived on my motorcycle, and the second meeting at the Clearing, Jen Jensen's home in Door County, Wisconsin in 1979. Susan reminded me that I had met Hugh Miller at the second meeting and suggested I call him for advice. I wasn't looking for a job with NPS, just advice. I wanted to see Hugh. I went to see you, then Chief Historical Architect at the Washington office. He listened very carefully. As always, he was very polite, and he would see if he could suggest anyone else with whom I should talk. I thanked him and left thinking that was it and it was time to go back to the Midwest. 2 days later, Hugh called me and asked me to come see him. He had an idea, a vision really, and it went like this. NPS was very good at understanding and caring for historic structures, and it was very good at caring for natural landscapes. But there were all these other places where people had lived, changed the landscape, and left their imprint. NPS wanted to address those places. Was I interested in joining that effort? Tom Kane, who some of you may remember, was a remarkable practitioner from New York and Vermont, and Tom was also very essential to this early effort. And I had met Tom at the New Harmony meeting as well. In this way, as I later learned, and as Randy just said, I became the first NPS historical landscape architect. Hugh was my mentor and a lifelong friend, and we worked together for many, many years, and we are still in close touch. At the time, The National Register office was in the same building at 11th and L in DC. One day, Hugh suggested we take the elevator upstairs and talk with Carol Scholl, then keeper of the register. We carefully explained what we were doing. Carol, in her brilliance, said to me that putting cultural landscapes on the register was like nailing jelly to a wall. It could not be done. In the elevator, as we left, Hugh said, "We have a lot of work to do," and that was an understatement, to say the least. And we still have a lot of work to do 45 years later. And I'll return to the register in a few minutes. It is not one of my favorite processes. So what are the issues or challenges that I want to throw your way today? I do need to tell you that I was aided in thinking by 3 other scholars. Lori Matthews is here today. Noah Kerr, a UO PhD, is now teaching full-time at Oregon. And Hannah Six, one of my colleagues on my recently closed out research team. I've worked closely with all of them, and they have continued. I continue to thank them for their advice and their wisdom over the years, but everything I'm saying today is my responsibility, not theirs. Let me say now that I'm not a fan of the term preservation, and for years wouldn't use it till I was battered around by some colleagues, preferring instead to think of what we do as protection. I've given to use the term preservation, but not always willingly. I have come to believe that isolating cultural landscapes as a resource type is a mistake. Those places sit in the ecotone between culture and nature and should be understood that way. We recently completed a CLR for Carlsbad Caverns Underground, and our team, at the park's urging and Julie's suggestion, included Diana Northup, a microbiologist, a speleologist, and ecologist from the University of New Mexico. Diana has spent decades studying the ecology of Carlsbad Caverns' natural system, how it has changed over time, and how it is challenged. When we explained the cultural landscape approach to Diana, she said she had never heard of this before, but was actually pretty interested. And we had never heard about what she did, as her research focuses on the microbial ecology of caves around the world, studying fungi, molds, and other impacts on the cave systems and structures. It was one more lesson in a search for answers over the past 45 years. Well, we all give a nod to understanding natural systems. Do we really? Do we include project team members who perhaps have never heard of cultural landscapes, yet can help us learn so much about the landscapes in our purview? We need to think about natural systems with the same approach that we take to cultural landscapes. We can't lump all natural systems under one category, just as we have developed a variety of cultural landscape characteristics and components. Let's include diverse team members where appropriate in climatology, hydrology, geomorphology, paleontology, and plant genetics, and the list goes on. It's a much longer list. There are a few other concerns that have been on my mind, some more recently and some very long term. While I'm not suggesting solutions today, that's up to all of you, I am suggesting we confront these issues head on. So here they are, some basic, some more intricate. I will say that some of them may seem contradictory, and I actually expect some of you may disagree with me, which is actually preferable. Is cultural landscape even the right standalone term? I recently looked back at some early work from the 1980s and was reminded that originally we described these places as historic. They were historic cultural landscapes. One might say that any landscape touched by human hands is a cultural landscape. Take a look at the early work of Carl Sauer, Fred Niffen, J.B. Jackson, and Marion Shord, among others. Shord suggested that landscapes are often viewed as a jumble, quote, a jumble of objects whose origin, function, and relationship to each other are mysteries. Cultural landscapes can often seem like a jumble, demanding far more explanation than everyday or even extraordinary historic buildings or archaeological sites. There is, quote, Shord, difficulty of defining the limits to any particular stretch of the landscape in space and time. So where does the cultural landscape end, and when did it begin? Where does it begin? How do we understand and explain that mystery? We grapple with this in every single project we work on, and yet I'm not sure we succeed. I often tell my students, or I used to when I was still teaching, that cultural landscapes were places that we look at every day, but we never really see. The term cultural landscape seems to apply to a variety of resource types, and only really works if there's a shared understanding of its meaning, as we already heard this morning. Right now, and I think once we step outside this room, maybe even in this room, I don't think there is a shared meaning. Does this mean we need to reinvent professional terms or become more effective translators of what we are doing. Working with cultural landscapes requires basic familiarity with some materials and pathology. It is not possible to guide sound or realistic decision-making in aging infrastructure without awareness of how constructed features have been built and how they will change over time. How much attention do we pay to past practices, or do we primarily focus on products of those practices? This leads to the question of change as a fundamental characteristic of places. And you all know that, but I don't think the National Register does. So I'm going to dive into the register and hope we're all prepared. The National Register, I was going to say something else. The National Register envelope does not truly engage cultural landscapes. That may have been stated by Carol Scholl in 1980, but the recognition of these landscapes has been forced into that box, doing the landscapes and their protection a disservice. The environmental movement, for example, has captured so much vigor and attention, yet one can argue that there really is no wilderness left on this planet. The register, I agree, is an excellent way for us to officially recognize and record significant places in American history. A fundamental register concept, however, is the emphasis on how little a resource has changed since its period of significance. You all know that, I believe. The register process, however, fails to recognize the basic cultural landscape concept of change, desirable change, necessary change, and character-defining change, as Randy and Andrea already spoke about. In this way, the National Register process forces cultural landscapes into a paradigm that is often incongruous with the resource. While we do include period plans in cultural landscape reports, as you know, the final analysis is often founded on identifying as little change as possible. The early guidelines for reports included landscape process and product. And I'm not suggesting we return to those olden times, but we have lost something by not including landscape process in the analytical continuum. While we seek to protect the landscape so that we can understand its meaning in our lives, the processes of landscape dynamics are often overlooked in this conversation. We are tempted to look at the landscape images and not the processes, buoyed perhaps by our reliance on static likenesses originally, but not still, initiated by Kodak Brownie cameras and Wish You Were Here postcards. This leads to some contemporary forces pushing that continuum. For starters, we all recognize, as we've already heard, that climate change is an ever-present power in our landscapes, and we know this. But how do we measure it, and more importantly, how do we understand its impact on the landscapes we are seeking to protect? Responding to climate variability is no longer simply a broad-scale strategic consideration or an additional layer, but must be intrinsic to our expectations about effective treatment. The ever more powerful changes in our climate require that we recognize a range of landscape impacts, from subtle to dramatic. For example, beyond the generalized term climate change, do we understand, engage, and apply concepts such as sensitivity, exposure, adaptive capacity, mitigation, resilience, uncertainty, and vulnerability, to name a few? And I know many of you do, so thank you for doing that. I know much of this is not news to all of you, but how are we responding? Should we consider redefining what we mean by significance and contributing features? When we respond to these impacts on the landscape, do we think about taking no action and documenting the landscape as we prepare for its loss, or interpret the change for others to learn from, or perhaps manage the change and improve the landscape's resilience? We need to move beyond the customarily accepted cultural landscapes treatment into a range of actions that engage the work of other fields, other skills, and other ideas, as we recently heard. Cultural landscape research and engagement should take on at least two other challenges. Do we willingly and readily describe the landscapes that have done environmental harm and damage? A few years ago, my research team did a CLI and then a CLR for a portion of the Los Alamos National Laboratory on a site where there was early development of the atomic bomb, as you all know. The process of building this site did much environmental damage to the landscape and, of course, welcomed in the atomic age. We were fascinated by its history, but greatly disturbed by what we knew and what we learned in this process. It was clear we needed to be neutral, but that was very uncomfortable. And what about changes in our perspectives, as evidenced by the increased recognition of Native American and African American landscapes, as Andrea just so eloquently described for us? Do we understand that Native American is not just one category, but needs to be applied to hundreds of specific cultural groups that occupied this landscape long before us immigrants arrived? How do we increase cross-cultural awareness and expanded context to address overlaps in cultural influences, identities, and uses? This should include interdisciplinary engagement with specialized historians, as well as natural resource perspectives to expand the layers of knowledge that have influenced sites over time. And what about integrating multinational and multicultural influences, as well as regionally specific aspects of design and interpretation to acknowledge the numerous identities tied to site histories? Cultural landscapes are not always or even ever have been linked to only one cultural group. Susan Dolan, who many of you know and couldn't be here today, advised us many years ago, for example, that including physical accessibility as a treatment as our obligation, not an option. Are there other changes in our society's values that we need to incorporate into our work? It wasn't that many years ago, for example, that a box of Crayola crayons included one marked flesh tone, and we all know what that meant. It was the tone of the young Caucasian white children using the crayons. Today, there's a box of crayons labeled colors, 24 crayons labeled colors of the world. How do we apply this advancement to our work in cultural landscapes? Is there just one way to approach them? What about landscapes that are intentionally left untouched, as many of you know, which is a human decision affecting that place, and hence a cultural landscape? Foundations are important, of course, but rigid adherence to established truths is limiting and at worst can be dangerous. The nature of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts demands that we regularly test our methods, our techniques, and our theories. We need to respond to that which we cannot always control. We hear of paradigm shifts, but as Thomas Kuhn reminded us, these are really revolutions in our thinking, not merely shifts. What we need is a revolution and not merely a shift in our thinking about significant cultural landscapes, their protection, and our response to human-inflicted changes to our ecological systems. Now, we live in a world of relativity and not absolutes, as we all know. Cold in Oregon, where I left yesterday, is pretty mild here in Philadelphia, and wet in Philadelphia is just a normal winter in Oregon, except given changes in climate change. While context is not everything, in at least some ways we can think of it as our societal petri dish. I don't want to belabor this point, but it is essential for this discussion to remind ourselves that landscapes never exist out of context, except perhaps when they are stolen or removed. We are all familiar, I trust, with the arguments around the Elgin marbles, which David Lowenthal first told me about, and closer to home, the removal of Native American artifacts to big city out of situ museums. I first learned about Native communities in the Pacific Northwest as a child by visiting the Museum of American History in New York. Taking resources out of context, even thinking about them out of context, turns them into objects rather than dynamic resources. In these cases, it also places those resources in what is quite literally a foreign culture. We are in danger of considering cultural landscapes within a constant or predictable context and fail to fully appreciate or duly recognize the dynamic nature of the larger environmental milieu. As discussed regarding climate change by myself and many others over the years, we too often assume that the larger ecological context is static within an acceptable dynamic range, such as seasons, warm and cold years, wet and dry summers, and so on. And thus, each of the directions for recognizing, evaluating, and treating cultural landscapes is based on a greater level of constancy than we now experience or might reasonably expect and anticipate. We are left with an approach to landscapes that is not fully adaptable to systemic variations and idiosyncrasies and sets unrealistic expectations and aspirations. What happens if the cultural landscape context is no longer as predictable as it once was? How might we proactively respond, and what can we do? Context, of course, is an idea that is too easily forgotten, pushed aside, or left for the next scholar or practitioner. There is no way to avoid our changing context as the fear around climate change plays out in our scientific communities, our social interactions, our everyday activities, and our political debates, especially in the coming 4 years. There is no way to hide from these realities, and yet we seem as a society to be doing a very good job of just that. The other big issue is the idea and implementation of integrity criteria. Now, I don't want to argue about the 7 details of the National Register criteria. You all know those. We have been arguing about them since they were first introduced following the 1966 historic preservation legislation and amendments. I'm sure that many of you are familiar not only with the criteria, but also with the difficulty of their application and the seemingly endless discussion about what they really mean and how to apply them. Linked to our changing global context, the determination of integrity should be re-examined. Is it possible to accept the idea that integrity, like cultural landscapes, is a dynamic concept, and that we must dig deeper than the landscape frame to fully engage its meaning? We need to fully accept the reality that cultural landscapes are dynamic and evolving. And I want to be clear about something. I am not opposed to the idea of integrity, even though I have problems with the word in this context. I can live with that, and I get it. I know it. I understand that. I am suggesting, however, that the preservation community adapt a more flexible and creative approach to its application. For example, when we work with cultural landscapes, it is often valuable to identify the true character-defining features rather than the detailed and specific material culture. If an agricultural field has been a seasonal crop rotation for 100 years, does it really matter if the same crop is being used as it has always been? If a significant design garden is losing its trees as the climate warms or dries ever so slightly, do we replace those same trees with the same genus and species, thereby ensuring their future demise? Or do we search for a new variety that provides a parallel degree of shade, canopy cover, branching pattern, leaf size, and deciduous detritus? Does it matter more that a landscape retains the exact tree genus and species, or that the spatial and visual consequences of those trees are maintained? Would it be better to plant replacement trees that are more resilient, resistant to warming, or to replant trees that will not survive their 21st century environment? I want to close with 4 thoughts and challenges for all of us, myself included. First, we must accept the premise of an uncertain but certainly variable future for these places, embracing flexibility in our approaches and encouraging frequent reassessment of these places. Second, we must adapt to change in ways to accept it, mitigate it, and set priorities. How much do these changes matter in terms of the resources we are trying to protect? This may mean greater proactive intervention rather than waiting till undesired change has occurred. Third, we must expand our teams to be more inclusive of views and expertise that think beyond what we have done to date and challenge us in what we are doing. And fourth, we should be prepared to make difficult decisions about which resources to save, which landscapes are salvageable and which landscapes are not, perhaps practicing cultural landscape triage, choosing to save certain places while letting other ones remain only an historic record. I want to thank the University of Pennsylvania, especially Randy and his team, and I really look forward to what will happen for the rest of today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I'd like to, I'd like to open up for a little bit of discussion to be able to respond directly to these 2 really great and rich talks. And I'll, if Jake, could you grab the microphone and pass it down, and would ask those of you who ask questions to do it loudly enough that we can hear it and repeat it back for the recording. And given that I'm in front of one of the other microphones, I'll take the privilege of asking, just making maybe one observation, if you both would react to it, if you like. one of the things that I think you both provoke me about, and that has been in my mind for as long as I've been teaching, where I've always taught in schools of design, although I'm not trained as a capital D designer. I use that Herbert Simon definition that, changing existing conditions to preferred conditions is design. So I kind of, whether my colleagues like it or not, I call myself a designer sometimes. But I think what it foregrounds is that creativity is part of what we need to bring more to bear, to deal with this enormous range and depth and complexity of issues. And I think you both talked very specifically about needs for creativity. And maybe if you could just riff for a second about how that has been part of your teaching and practice already, in ways that maybe push even yourselves, as I feel pushed myself to let go of my certainties and to lean into the need for the uncertainties of creativity.
Oh, thanks, Randy. That's a really good question. I think that, is this on? Okay. I think that one of the ways you do that is, first of all, by listening to others, and I think we've learned that through talking to other people, and being willing to accept criticism, and being willing, and valid criticism, just being willing to accept it when people say to you, this is not working right, this is not working as well as it should be, and here's why. And I think that's always an important lesson for anybody working in the field, whether you're a practitioner or an academic, policymaker. It really doesn't matter. I think that's one of the really, really important ways. The other thing, I think, is that you need to look back at yourself and look at what you're doing. As I said, I wrote this talk about 2 weeks ago, and I probably edited it 10 times. Changing word here, word there, fixing it, cleaning it, and I'm sure if I just reading it just now, I thought, oh, I should have changed that word. I should have, I could have redone that. And I think that's also part of the creativity, is really, as you are with a designer. I am really a fan of tracing paper for that reason, because I think too often people put things on a screen and it's there and it's harder to change. And I see that with students often, that it's really helpful to have tracing paper, because it's easier to make multiple changes, multiple things. So being able to do that, I don't know if that starts to get at what you were asking.
Everybody listen and go buy tracing paper.
Yeah, right. I do not own any stakes in tracing paper, but I do happen to love yellow tracing paper.
I'm glad that you brought up tracing paper because, creative practice is important. So I too am not anything even close to a designer, but I have found that if I didn't have this love of photography, even with my little tacky smartphone, and I flood all of social media with my little pictures all the time, but I think if not for that practice, I would not see the way I see. And that way of seeing, I used to find annoying. My father is a photographer, not professionally, but he is an amazing photographer, collector of cameras. And I'd always groan, oh, here we go again, more pictures. But it wasn't until that practice became part of my own research in these communities that I understood how much seeing and being open to seeing differently was possible. So I would say whatever practice that is for you, I think is key to doing this work. Whatever, even if it's music, what have you, but really embracing it and not necessarily having to be good at it, which I know is very hard for all of the exacting professional experts in the room.
I do have one more comment about that. This is for people who teach studio. I taught for years in a university where studios were, A, B, C, F, that. And then when I moved to Oregon, studios are not graded, they're pass fail. And I have become an absolute advocate of that, because it meant that students really listened to what you were telling them. It's very common at Oregon for students to approach you and say, last term you reviewed my studio, but I didn't get to talk to you. If I put my work up from last term, I'm already done with it. Would you please critique it now for me? Because you end up being interested in the content, not in the grade. And I think that extends to the work that we do.
Great. Thanks. So let me just open it up to who might have a question or a comment to follow on. Now's that other time in the session where you come forth with whatever you're thinking about.
Thank you, Brenda. I agree with you. Okay, there was a lot of political pressure because it was a joint project between NPS and Los Alamos National Laboratory, and although we could describe what happened, we were really not in a position to say, you know, what you guys did was terrible. That's what I meant by neutrality. They also, I didn't mention also because at the time, but the site was in a valley floor with valley walls, and the original site was just a valley floor until it was very clear that there had been a lot of Native American impact on the valley walls, and we insisted that the site be to include those, working with Allison and Julie. So I think that was part of it. Is we need to extend what we're looking at here, but the neutrality was I would say more under the political pressure of wanting to be very careful about what we're doing. But I really agree with you about that. No, as I said, it was very reluctant, and it came after many that we couldn't really include that in the CLR. That's what I meant by neutrality. So in that regard, I want to give a real call out to Allison Kennedy, who was our contact, our major Park Service contact when we did the work at Carlsbad. There were a lot of mistakes done at Carlsbad Caverns over the years, a lot of conscious decisions made that we were involved in looking at and saying, how do we correct this? And Allison was a major supporter of us doing that. So in some ways, we were being very, critical of past work that was done, and how can we now suggest ways that could be improved. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to do more of that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Jenny and I go back many years. I would put it that way, as colleagues and as close friends. Jenny, I let me say that my comments were meant for this room, but I fully, and they were written before the election, and to be honest, but I fully agree with you about the dangers, the uncertain dangers that we're facing as we move into the future. But thanks, Jenny. We should talk.
And I think this, I hope, and I'll do it myself, that this issue of neutrality and whether neutrality is possible, let alone desirable, I think we have to lean into in terms of how it plays in private practice versus Park Service practice versus academia versus activism. We have to have, I think, a very open discussion about those, our positionality on those. So I'm going to say, in the interest of time, just one more question. Stephanie, I saw your hand.
So if I could speak to both of those, and thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the language of preservation versus the language of stewardship. And stewardship is about responsibility, and it somewhat even transcends the construct of property because it can happen in so many different ways. And so I think a lot of our discussion about, using a different word such as keeper or what have you, I think it does matter to think more creatively about even what we think we're doing. So one of the most deflating things you can tell a preservation student is this fact that 75% of historic preservation is regulatory. And they go, well, they just, so we need to give them something to go on, right? And part of that is all of the different levels and types of expertise that you mentioned, Robert, that should be on the team, and then all of the people who aren't at the table and don't even use this language. And so even before we get to National Register, or we get to listing and we get to integrity, we have to keep people invested, as you were saying, about how much even talking about it was a lightning rod, which I had no perspective on, was really enlightening, though I guessed it, but I didn't know it for sure. But now more than ever, I think it's also how do we frame what we do that we should be thinking about at the same time that we're thinking about the inadequacy of the terms that we've been given.
And if I could add one comment, really an added comment to that, I think a lot of our responsibility, Beth, is to do a better job of educating other people. And I think to do a better job of being out there as Andrea is doing. And I think, I think if you think of our talks together as a keynote, that they really kind of built on each other. And I know from Randy's point of view, that was very intentional. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, so just in the interest of time, I think we should take our break now, holding the conflicts and the tensions about all these ideas that have been put on the table. So we have a couple more days to figure it all out and answer it.